The dust kicked up around Kane Zeller's boots as he dismounted his chestnut mare on the outskirts of Nogales, Arizona territory. The late afternoon sun of 1877 beating down mercilessly on the parched earth. He had been riding for 3 days straight from Texas, tracking a stolen herd that had gone cold somewhere near the border, and his water was running dangerously low. The landscape stretched endlessly in shades of brown and gold, punctuated by the occasional saguaro cactus standing sentinel against the blazing sky. Kane led his horse toward what looked like a small creek bed, hoping against hope that there would be water. His throat felt like sandpaper, and his mare was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. As he approached, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks, the sound of sobbing, raw and desperate, cutting through the desert silence like a knife. He moved cautiously toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. In his experience, nothing good came from unexpected encounters in the wilderness, especially this close to the border where outlaws and desperados made their living preying on travelers. But as he rounded a cluster of rocks, he saw not a threat but a woman, sitting alone beside the dried creek bed, her dress torn and dusty, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She looked up at his approach, her eyes wide with fear and something else, resignation, perhaps as if she had given up hope of rescue. Kane raised his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "Madam," he said, his voice rough from thirst and disuse, "are you hurt?" The woman stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was real or some desert mirage. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, but even in her disheveled state, Kane could see she was beautiful, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of dark honey. She looked to be in her early 20s, perhaps a year or two younger than his own 26 years. "I'm lost," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been walking for 2 days. I have no water left." Kane immediately pulled his canteen from his saddle and brought it to her. She drank greedily, and he had to gently pull it away before she made herself sick. "Easy now," he said softly. "Small sips." As he knelt beside her, he noticed something glinting at her throat, a silver locket on a delicate chain, catching the sunlight. It seemed out of place somehow, too fine for her otherwise plain appearance, too well kept compared to her tattered clothing. "Can you tell me what happened?" Kane asked, sitting back on his heels. "How did you come to be out here alone?" The woman's hand moved unconsciously to the locket, clutching it as if it were a lifeline. "The wagon train I was traveling with was attacked 3 days ago," she said, her voice trembling. "Bandits. They killed the men, took most of the women and children. I managed to escape during the chaos, but I've been wandering ever since. I don't know where I am or which direction to go." Kane felt his jaw tighten. Wagon train attacks were becoming more common as desperate men took advantage of travelers heading west. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "And you're about 5 miles from Nogales. I can take you there." She nodded, relief flooding her features. Then her hand moved again to the locket and she opened it carefully. Inside, Kane could see a small photograph, faded and worn. It showed a family, a man, woman, and young girl, all smiling at the camera. "This holds my last happy memory," she said quietly, staring at the image with such profound sadness that Kane felt his chest constrict. "This was taken 5 years ago, before everything fell apart. Before my parents died of fever, before I had to leave our home in Missouri. Before I agreed to this foolish journey west that cost so many lives." Kane didn't know what to say to that, so he simply offered his hand to help her stand. "I'm Kane," he said. "Kane Zeller." "Rebecca," she replied, accepting his help. "Rebecca Miller." Her legs were unsteady after sitting for so long, and Kane steadied her with a hand on her elbow. She was shorter than he had expected, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. He could feel her trembling, whether from exhaustion, fear, or both, he couldn't say. "Can you ride?" he asked, gesturing to his mare. "She's tired, but she can carry us both to town if we take it slow." Rebecca nodded, and Kane helped her into the saddle before mounting behind her. She stiffened at the proximity, but he kept a respectful distance as much as was possible while sharing a horse, wrapping one arm loosely around her waist to steady her while keeping the other on the reins. The ride to Nogales took nearly 2 hours, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Rebecca remained silent for most of the journey, her hand never straying far from the locket at her throat. Kane found himself curious about her story, about the photograph she guarded so fiercely, but he didn't press her. She would talk when she was ready. As they approached the town, Rebecca finally spoke. "I have no money," she said quietly. "Nothing at all. Everything I owned was in the wagon." "We'll figure something out," Kane assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure how. Nogales was a rough border town, not particularly known for its charity or hospitality. Most people here were either running from something or chasing after the next big opportunity, and neither type tended to have much sympathy for strangers in need. They rode down the main street as the last rays of sunlight faded, the buildings casting long shadows across the dusty road. Kane could feel eyes on them from every direction, from the saloon windows, from the general store, from the clusters of men gathered outside the livery. A lone cowboy riding into town with a disheveled woman would naturally attract attention, and not all of it friendly. Kane stopped in front of the boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure that looked only slightly less weathered than the other buildings. He dismounted first and then helped Rebecca down, noting how she swayed on her feet. She needed food, rest, and probably medical attention, though she hadn't complained. The proprietor of the boarding house was a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Garrett who looked at them both with undisguised suspicion. "We don't rent rooms by the hour," she said flatly, her arms crossed over her ample chest. "That's not what we're looking for," Kane said, keeping his voice level. "This woman survived an attack on her wagon train. She needs a safe place to stay while we figure out her next steps." Mrs. Garrett's expression softened slightly as she took in Rebecca's appearance, the torn dress, the bruises on her arms, the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "You vouching for her character?" she asked Kane. "I am," he replied without hesitation, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. He had only known Rebecca for a few hours, but something about her resonated with him, made him want to protect her. "Rooms $3 a week, meals included," Mrs. Garrett said. "Payment in advance." Kane reached into his pocket and counted out the coins, knowing it would leave him short for his own accommodations. He would have to find work quickly if he wanted to avoid sleeping in the livery. Mrs. Garrett led them upstairs to a small but clean room with a single bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. "Supper's at 6, she said. "You look like you could use a meal and a bath, young lady." After Mrs. Garrett left, Rebecca turned to Kane with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." "Don't worry about it," Kane said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He wasn't used to being thanked. In his line of work, people usually cursed him or shot at him, sometimes both. "You get some rest. I'll be downstairs if you need anything." He turned to leave, but Rebecca's voice stopped him. "Kane, would you sit with me for just a moment? I don't want to be alone yet." There was something in her voice, a vulnerability that made it impossible for him to refuse. He nodded and took a seat in the wooden chair by the window while Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Tell me about the photograph," Kane found himself saying. "The one in your locket." Rebecca's fingers moved to the silver pendant, and she opened it again, staring at the image with that same expression of longing and loss. "That's my mother and father," she said softly, "and me when I was 17. We lived on a farm outside of Independence, Missouri. It wasn't much, but it was home. My father grew wheat and my mother kept chickens and a vegetable garden. We weren't rich, but we were happy." "What happened?" Kane asked gently. "Scarlet fever swept through our county in the winter of '72, Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My parents both caught it. They died within days of each other. I survived, but I lost everything. The bank took the farm to pay off debts I didn't even know existed. I had nowhere to go, no family left. An aunt in California wrote to me, said she would take me in if I could make the journey west." "So you joined the wagon train," Kane concluded. Rebecca nodded. "It seemed like my only option. I worked for a year in Independence to save enough money for the passage. I thought I was going to finally have a chance at a new life, a fresh start. Instead, I watched good people die, watched children torn from their mother's arms, and I ran. I just ran and kept running until I couldn't run anymore." "You survived," Kane said firmly. "That's what matters. You survived. But at what cost?" Rebecca looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I left those people behind. I didn't try to help them. I just thought about saving myself." "If you had stayed, you would be dead or worse," Kane said bluntly. "You made the only choice you could. Don't torture yourself over it." Rebecca was silent for a long moment. Then she closed the locket with a soft click. "This photograph is the only thing I have left of my old life," she said. "The last time I remember being truly happy, truly safe. Sometimes I open it and try to remember what that felt like, but it seems like it happened to someone else, in another lifetime." Kane felt something twist in his chest at her words. He understood that feeling more than she knew. His own past was littered with losses and regrets, memories of a life that seemed impossibly distant now. "Maybe you'll make new happy memories," he said, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. Rebecca gave him a sad smile. "Maybe," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Mrs. Garrett's voice called out, "Supper's ready if you're hungry." Kane stood up, adjusting his hat. "You should eat something," he told Rebecca. "Build up your strength. Will you join me?" she asked, and there was something almost pleading in her voice, as if she couldn't bear the thought of facing the dining room full of strangers alone. "Of course," Kane said, offering his arm. The dining room was crowded with boarders and locals who had paid for the evening meal. Conversations died down as Kane and Rebecca entered, and once again he felt the weight of curious and judgmental stares. He led Rebecca to a table in the corner, away from most of the crowd, and pulled out a chair for her. Mrs. Garrett served them herself, placing heaping plates of beef stew and fresh bread in front of them. Rebecca ate slowly at first, as if she had forgotten what real food tasted like, but then hunger took over and she cleaned her plate. Kane found himself watching her more than eating his own meal, noting the way some of the color was returning to her cheeks, the way her hands had stopped trembling. After supper, Kane walked Rebecca back to her room, conscious of the eyes still following them. When they reached her door, she hesitated, her hand on the knob. "Where will you stay tonight?" she asked. "I'll figure something out," Kane said with a shrug. "Don't worry about me." "You spent your money on my room," Rebecca said, and there was guilt in her voice. "That's not right." "I've slept in worse places than the livery," Kane assured her. "It's fine." Rebecca bit her lip, clearly wanting to argue but not knowing what to say. Finally, she just nodded. "Good night, Kane, and thank you again." "Good night, Rebecca." Kane made his way down to the street, leading his mare toward the livery at the edge of town. The night air was cool, a welcome relief after the scorching heat of the day. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more than Kane had ever seen back east, spreading across the heavens like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The liveryman, an old Mexican man named Esteban, agreed to let Kane sleep in the hayloft in exchange for mucking out the stalls in the morning. It wasn't a bad arrangement, and Kane had certainly done worse. He took care of his mare first, making sure she had food and water, checking her hooves for stones and her legs for any signs of strain. As he climbed up into the loft and settled into the hay, Kane found his thoughts returning to Rebecca. There was something about her that had gotten under his skin, and he couldn't quite figure out what it was. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her eyes, or the way she clutched that locket as if it were the only thing anchoring her to this world. Or maybe it was simply that he recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone who had lost everything and was trying to figure out how to keep going. Kane had been on his own since he was 16, when his father had died in a mining accident in Nevada. His mother had passed when he was just a baby, and he had no siblings, no other family to turn to. He had drifted from town to town, taking whatever work he could find: ranch hand, tracker, sometimes bounty hunter when the money was right. It was a lonely existence, but it was the only one he knew. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, Kane's dreams were filled with images of a dark-haired woman with haunted eyes, clutching a silver locket and whispering about lost memories. The next morning, Kane woke with the sun and kept his bargain with Esteban, cleaning out the stalls and spreading fresh hay. By the time he finished, his stomach was growling and he was covered in dust and horse smell. He went to the town well and splashed water on his face and arms, trying to make himself presentable. He found himself walking back toward the boarding house, telling himself he just wanted to check on Rebecca, to make sure she had survived the night without nightmares or illness. Mrs. Garrett was sweeping the front porch when he arrived, and she gave him a knowing look that made him uncomfortable. "She's in the dining room having breakfast," Mrs. Garrett said before he could ask. "And before you wonder, yes, she asked about you." Kane felt an odd flutter in his chest at those words, which annoyed him. He was not some green kid to be affected by a woman's inquiry. He was a grown man who had been on his own for 10 years, who had faced down outlaws and survived Indian raids and once even looked down the barrel of a loaded rifle without flinching. One woman should not be able to unsettle him like this. But when he walked into the dining room and saw Rebecca sitting at the same corner table from the night before, her hair brushed and pinned back, wearing a clean dress that Mrs. Garrett must have lent her, Kane felt that flutter again, stronger this time. Rebecca looked up and smiled when she saw him, and it transformed her entire face. The haunted look was still there in her eyes, but the smile was genuine and warm. "Good morning," she said. "Mrs. Garrett said you might come by. Have you eaten?" "Not yet," Kane admitted, taking the seat across from her. "Then join me," Rebecca said. "I can't eat all of this myself." She gestured to the generous spread in front of her: eggs, bacon, biscuits, and coffee. They ate together in comfortable silence for a while, and Kane found himself relaxing in her presence. There was no pressure to make conversation, no awkward attempts at small talk. It was nice, he realized, to share a meal with someone who didn't expect anything from him. "I've been thinking about what I should do next," Rebecca said eventually, setting down her coffee cup. "I don't have money for passage to California, and I don't have any other family. Mrs. Garrett mentioned that the hotel is looking for help, and the general store might need someone. I thought I could try to find work here in Nogales, save up enough to continue my journey." "That's a good plan," Kane said, though the thought of Rebecca staying in this rough border town made him uneasy. Nogales was not a safe place for a woman alone, especially one as beautiful and vulnerable as she was. "What about you?" Rebecca asked. "Were you just passing through, or do you have business here?" Kane considered how much to tell her. "I'm tracking a stolen herd," he said finally. "Trail went cold near here. I was planning to ask around, see if anyone had seen anything. After that, I'm not sure. I go where the work is." "That sounds like a lonely life," Rebecca observed, and there was no judgment in her voice, just sympathy. "It's the only one I've got," Kane said with a shrug. They finished breakfast, and Kane walked Rebecca to the hotel so she could inquire about work. The manager, a portly man with a handlebar mustache, looked her up and down in a way that made Kane's jaw clench. But he agreed to hire her as a chambermaid, starting immediately at $1 a day plus meals. "Thank you so much," Rebecca said, her relief evident. "I promise I'm a hard worker." "You better be," the manager said. "I don't tolerate laziness or theft. You steal from the guests, and I'll have the sheriff on you faster than you can blink." Kane didn't like the way the man was speaking to her, but Rebecca just nodded meekly and thanked him again. After they left the hotel, Kane pulled her aside. "If he gives you any trouble, you tell me," he said firmly. "You understand?" Rebecca looked up at him with surprise. "I can take care of myself," she said, but there was no heat in her words, just a quiet resignation. "I know you can," Kane said, "but you shouldn't have to. Not alone." Something flickered in Rebecca's eyes, hope, maybe, or disbelief that someone would offer to look out for her. "You're a good man, Kane Zeller," she said softly. Kane didn't know how to respond to that, so he just tipped his hat and said, "I should get going. I've got questions to ask about that herd." But as he walked away, he could feel Rebecca's eyes on his back, and that strange flutter was back in his chest, stronger than ever. Kane spent the next few days asking around about the stolen cattle, visiting every saloon and trading post in Nogales and the surrounding area. The trail was indeed cold, and no one seemed to have any useful information, or if they did, they weren't willing to share it with a stranger. By the fourth day, Kane was starting to accept that he had lost this particular trail, but he found he wasn't particularly upset about it. Each evening, he returned to the boarding house for supper, and each evening he found himself sitting with Rebecca, listening to her talk about her day. She told him about the demanding guests at the hotel, the way the other maids gossiped behind each other's backs, the small kindnesses that Mrs. Garrett showed her. And slowly, bit by bit, she began to open up about her past, about her parents and the life she had lost. Kane found himself sharing things too, stories he hadn't told anyone in years. About his father and the mining camp, about the first time he had tracked a runaway horse and realized he had a talent for it, about the time he had gotten lost in the desert for 3 days and survived on cactus fruit and morning dew. Rebecca listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was really paying attention, not just being polite. One evening, nearly a week after Kane had found her in the desert, they were sitting on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. Rebecca was off work early for once, and she seemed more relaxed than Kane had ever seen her. The locket glinted at her throat as it always did, but she wasn't clutching it compulsively the way she had at first. "Can I ask you something?" Kane said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Of course," Rebecca replied. "Why do you still wear the locket? Doesn't it just make you sad, constantly being reminded of what you lost?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her fingers moving to the silver pendant. "It does make me sad," she admitted. "But it also reminds me that I was happy once, that I was loved once." Sometimes, especially on the hardest days, I need that reminder. I need to know that the world wasn't always this cruel and difficult, that there was a time when I felt safe and cared for. Kane nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. I don't have anything like that, he said. No photographs, no mementos. Sometimes I wonder if that makes it easier or harder, not having anything to hold on to. I think it must be harder, Rebecca said, turning to look at him. At least I know where I came from, who I used to be. You seem like a man who's been running for so long, you've forgotten what you're running from. Her words struck him with unexpected force. No one had ever described him so accurately before, had seen through his carefully maintained facade of the tough, solitary cowboy who needed nothing and no one. Kane felt exposed in a way that should have made him uncomfortable, but instead he felt something else, relief maybe, that someone finally saw him. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe I have been running. What are you running from? Rebecca asked, her voice gentle. Kane considered the question. From being alone, he said finally, the admission surprising him even as he spoke it. From admitting that I'm tired of drifting from place to place with no one to care if I live or die. From wanting something more than just survival. Rebecca reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. Her touch was warm and light, but it sent a jolt through Kane's entire body. You don't have to run anymore, she said. Not if you don't want to. Kane turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers, marveling at how small her hand was in his, how right it felt. What if I don't know how to stop? He asked. Then maybe we can figure it out together, Rebecca said. And when she smiled at him, Kane felt something inside him shift, like a lock clicking open on a door he hadn't even realized was closed. Over the following weeks, Kane and Rebecca became inseparable. Kane took a job at the local ranch, breaking horses and mending fences, work that kept him in Nogales instead of drifting on to the next town. Every evening, he would clean up and meet Rebecca after her shift at the hotel, and they would walk through the town together, or sit on the porch, or sometimes ride out into the desert to watch the sunset. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and disappointments. Kane learned that Rebecca had wanted to be a teacher before her parents died, that she loved to read, but had lost all her books in the wagon train attack, that she was terrified of thunderstorms because one had destroyed part of their barn when she was a child. Rebecca learned that Kane could play the harmonica but was too shy to do it in front of people, that he had a weakness for apple pie, that he had once saved a man's life and refused any reward because it had been the right thing to do. The people of Nogales began to accept them as a couple, even though neither Kane nor Rebecca had put a name to what was growing between them. Mrs. Garrett stopped charging Kane for meals and started giving him knowing looks whenever he and Rebecca sat too close at the dining table. Esteban teased him about being love-struck. Even the hotel manager stopped leering at Rebecca once it became clear she had Kane's protection. But Kane was careful not to push too hard or too fast. He could see that Rebecca was still healing from her trauma, still carrying the weight of her losses. Some nights, he could see the haunted look return to her eyes, and she would clutch the locket and retreat into herself. On those nights, Kane would simply sit with her in silence, offering his presence as comfort, letting her know she wasn't alone. One particularly difficult night, Rebecca had a nightmare. Kane was walking past the boarding house on his way back from the livery when he heard her scream. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart pounding, and burst into her room without knocking. Rebecca was sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. "They were taking the children," she gasped. "I could hear them screaming and I just ran. I left them." Kane sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her into his arms, holding her while she sobbed against his chest. "You couldn't have saved them," he said firmly. "You would have died trying, and it wouldn't have changed anything." "But I didn't even try," Rebecca choked out. "What kind of person does that make me?" "A survivor," Kane said. "A human being who wanted to live. There's no shame in that, Rebecca. None." He held her until the sobs subsided, until her breathing evened out and she sagged against him in exhaustion. "Mrs. Garrett appeared in the doorway, her nightcap askew, but when she saw how Kane was holding Rebecca, she just nodded and quietly closed the door. "Stay," Rebecca whispered. "Please don't leave me alone tonight." Kane hesitated, aware of the impropriety, but he couldn't deny her. He stretched out on top of the covers beside her, fully clothed, and let her curl against his side. She fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, one hand still clutching the locket, and Kane lay awake for hours, listening to her breathe, feeling the weight of her trust in him like a sacred responsibility. By the time fall arrived, Kane had come to a realization that both exhilarated and terrified him. He was in love with Rebecca Miller. It had crept up on him slowly, so gradually that he hadn't recognized it, until it was already deeply rooted in his heart. He loved the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she always saw the good in people even after everything she had been through, the way she unconsciously reached for his hand whenever they walked together, as if she needed the connection as much as he did. But saying those words out loud was another matter entirely. Kane had never told anyone he loved them, had never felt this way about another person. What if she didn't feel the same? What if he scared her away? The thought of losing her was unbearable, so Kane kept his feelings to himself, content for the moment just to be near her. Rebecca, however, was apparently braver than he was. One evening in late October, as they sat together watching the stars come out, she turned to him and said, "Kane, I need to tell you something." Kane felt his heart start to race. "What is it?" Rebecca took a deep breath, her fingers moving to the locket as they always did when she was nervous. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said quietly. "Actually, I know I am. I've been in love with you for weeks now, maybe longer. And I know that's probably too fast, and maybe you don't feel the same way, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. After everything I've lost, I've learned that life is too short not to tell people how you feel." Kane stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. She loved him. Rebecca loved him. The beautiful, brave woman sitting beside him, who had survived things that would have broken most people, loved him. "Say something," Rebecca said, and he could hear the vulnerability in her voice. "Please." Kane cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "I love you too," he said, and the words came easier than he expected. "God, Rebecca, I love you so much it scares me. I didn't know I could feel this way about anyone." Rebecca's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy. "Really?" she asked, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Really," Kane confirmed, and then he kissed her. It was not Kane's first kiss, but it felt like it. Everything else faded away, the town, the stars, the world, until there was only Rebecca, her lips soft against his, her hands fisting in his shirt to pull him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Kane rested his forehead against hers. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "A real life, not just survival. I want to stop running." "I want that too," Rebecca whispered. "More than anything." They sat together under the stars for hours, making plans and dreaming about the future. Kane talked about buying a piece of land, building a house, maybe raising horses. Rebecca talked about having a home again, about planting a garden and filling their house with books and music. They talked about children someday, about growing old together, about all the happy memories they would make to replace the sad ones. What about your aunt in California?" Kane asked at one point. "Do you still want to go there?" Rebecca shook her head. "That was a plan I made when I had nowhere else to turn," she said. "But now I have you, and I have a chance at a real future here. My aunt doesn't even know if I'm alive or dead. I'll write to her, tell her what happened, but I want to stay in Nogales. This is starting to feel like home." Kane felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Good," he said, "because I don't want to let you go." The next few months passed in a blur of happiness. Kane worked hard at the ranch, saving every penny he could. Rebecca continued at the hotel, and together they began to build a life. Kane found a small piece of land on the outskirts of town, cheap, because the previous owner had abandoned it after the well ran dry. But Kane, with his experience tracking water in the desert, knew there was another source nearby, and he was proven right when he dug a new well and struck water at 20 feet. He began building their house himself, working on his days off and late into the evenings. It wasn't much, just a simple 2-room cabin with a porch, but it was theirs. Rebecca helped whenever she could, and slowly the house took shape. They scrounged furniture from the mercantile, bought a stove from a family leaving town, collected dishes and linens from Mrs. Garrett, who was surprisingly sentimental about seeing them start their life together. In December, on a cold night with snow dusting the distant mountains, Kane asked Rebecca to marry him. He didn't have a ring, just a simple silver band he had bought from a Mexican silversmith in town. But Rebecca cried happy tears and said yes without hesitation. They were married in January of 1878 by the circuit preacher who passed through Nogales once a month. The ceremony was simple, held in the boarding house parlor with Mrs. Garrett, Esteban, and a few other friends in attendance. Rebecca wore a dress that Mrs. Garrett had helped her sew from fabric Kane had bought at the mercantile, and she carried wildflowers that Kane had ridden 20 miles to find. She wore the locket, as always, but when Kane saw her walking toward him, he knew they were about to create memories that would be just as precious as the one she carried. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Kane kissed his bride, he felt like the luckiest man alive. This woman, who had lost everything, had chosen to build a new life with him. She saw something in him worth loving, worth trusting, and that meant more to Kane than all the gold in California. They moved into their little house the next day. It wasn't finished, the floors were still rough, and half the windows had cloth instead of glass, but it was theirs. Kane carried Rebecca over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zeller," he said, still marveling at the sound of her new name. "Home," Rebecca repeated, looking around with tears in her eyes. "I never thought I'd have one again." That night, they lay together in their bed, a simple wooden frame Kane had built himself, with blankets and a feather mattress they had saved for months to afford. Rebecca's head rested on Kane's chest, her hair spilling across his shoulder, and Kane felt a contentment he had never known existed. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Rebecca propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hand moving instinctively to the locket at her throat. But for the first time since he had met her, she didn't open it, didn't look at the photograph inside. Instead, she smiled at Kane with a warmth that seemed to light up the entire room. "I'm happy," she said. "For the first time in 5 years, I'm truly happy, and I don't need this anymore to remember what that feels like." She reached up and unfastened the locket, holding it in her palm. "This was my last happy memory, but now I'm making new ones, better ones, with you." She set the locket carefully on the small table beside the bed, and Kane understood the significance of the gesture. She wasn't throwing away her past or forgetting her parents, but she was choosing to live in the present, to look forward instead of back. Kane pulled her back down and kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and gratitude into that single gesture. "I promise you," he said when they broke apart, "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you have happy memories, so many that you won't be able to count them all." "I know you will," Rebecca whispered, and then there were no more words, just the two of them holding each other close as the winter wind howled outside their little house. The first year of their marriage was not without its challenges. Money was tight, and there were times when they survived on little more than beans and hope. Kane's work at the ranch was sometimes inconsistent, and Rebecca had to quit her job at the hotel when the manager made advances she firmly rebuffed. But they faced every obstacle together, and somehow that made even the hardest times bearable. In the spring, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. She told Kane one morning as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of pink and gold. Kane was so overcome with emotion that he couldn't speak for a full minute, just pulled her into his arms and held her while tears streamed down his face. "We're going to have a baby," he finally managed to say, and the wonder in his voice made Rebecca laugh through her own tears. "Are you happy?" she asked, echoing his question from their wedding night. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Kane said. "Rebecca, you've given me everything. A home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that I found you in that desert." The pregnancy was difficult. Rebecca suffered from severe morning sickness for the first few months, and the Arizona heat in the summer made her miserable. But Kane was devoted, tending to her every need, making sure she ate even when she felt too sick, carrying her to bed when she was too exhausted to walk. He built a bigger bed, installed glass in all the windows, and expanded the house to add another room for the baby. Mrs. Garrett, who had become something of a surrogate mother to them both, gave Rebecca advice and helped prepare for the baby's arrival. She taught Rebecca how to sew baby clothes and helped gather the necessary supplies. Esteban carved a beautiful cradle from mesquite wood as a gift, and even the ranch owner, a gruff man named Harrison, gave Kane a raise and more stable hours when he learned about the coming child. In November, after 12 hours of labor that left Kane pacing a trench in their porch while Mrs. Garrett attended to Rebecca inside, their son was born. Kane held the tiny, red-faced infant in his arms and felt his entire world shift. This perfect little person, this miracle, was half him and half the woman he loved more than life itself. "What should we name him?" Rebecca asked, exhausted but glowing with happiness as Kane carefully placed their son in her arms. Kane had been thinking about this for months. "What was your father's name?" he asked. "Robert," Rebecca said, her eyes filling with tears. "Robert James Miller. Then how about James?" Kane suggested. "James Kane Zeller." Rebecca smiled, looking down at their son with infinite tenderness. "James," she whispered. "Welcome to the world, James." Being a father changed Kane in ways he hadn't expected. Every decision he made now was filtered through the lens of what was best for his family. He took on extra work, started breeding horses on the side, anything to provide more security for Rebecca and James. But he also made sure to be present, to be there for the important moments: James's first smile, his first laugh, his first attempts to crawl. Rebecca blossomed into motherhood. Despite the trauma she had experienced, or perhaps because of it, she was fiercely protective of their son while also being gentle and loving. She sang to him constantly, songs her mother had sung to her, and Kane would often come home to find her dancing around the house with James in her arms, both of them laughing. The locket still sat on Rebecca's bedside table, and sometimes Kane would catch her looking at it, but he noticed she didn't clutch it desperately anymore. It had become what it should be, a cherished memory, but not a weight holding her back. When James was 6 months old, Rebecca told Kane she wanted to have another photograph taken. "I want James to have what I had," she explained. "A picture of his family happy together, so that if anything ever happens, he'll know he was loved." Kane understood, though he hated the thought of anything happening to either of them. They traveled to Tucson, where there was a photographer with proper equipment, and had a formal portrait made. Rebecca held James, and Kane stood behind them with his hand on her shoulder. They were all dressed in their best clothes, and when the photographer told them to remain still, Kane thought about how far they had come from that first desperate meeting in the desert to this moment. A family united and whole. The photograph turned out beautifully. Rebecca had copies made and sent one to her aunt in California with a long letter explaining everything that had happened. To Kane's surprise, her aunt wrote back, expressing relief that Rebecca was alive and happiness that she had found love. She sent gifts for James and invited them to visit someday, though she understood if they chose to stay in Arizona. Rebecca also had a new photograph placed in her locket, replacing the old one. It showed just her, Kane, and James, and when Kane asked about the original photograph of her parents, Rebecca carefully tucked it into a Bible she kept on the shelf. "They'll always be part of me," she said. "But I'm not that girl in the picture anymore. I'm a wife and a mother, and my present is so much brighter than my past." The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. When James was 2, Rebecca became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Rebecca's mother. 2 years after that came another son, Thomas. Their little house had to be expanded again and again to accommodate their growing family, until it bore little resemblance to the simple cabin Kane had first built. Kane's horse breeding business became quite successful, and they were able to buy more land, hire help, and build a proper barn. Rebecca started a small school for the children of Nogales, teaching reading and arithmetic in their front room twice a week. She filled their house with books, just as she had dreamed, and their children grew up surrounded by stories and learning. Life wasn't always easy. There were droughts that killed crops, sickness that swept through the town, moments of fear and worry. But Kane and Rebecca faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. Kane had learned to express his feelings instead of bottling them up, and Rebecca had learned to let go of guilt and embrace joy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kane surprised Rebecca with a celebration. He had their friends gather at the house, including Mrs. Garrett, who was now in her 70s but still sharp as a tack, and Esteban, who had become like a grandfather to their children. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and at one point Kane stood up to make a toast. "10 years ago," he said, holding up his glass, "I was a man with no home, no family, and no purpose beyond survival. Then I found a woman in the desert, and she changed everything. Rebecca, you taught me what it means to love, to hope, to believe in the future. You gave me 3 beautiful children and a life beyond my wildest dreams. Every day with you is a gift." Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes as everyone applauded. Then she stood up beside Kane, her hand finding his just as it had 1,000 times before. "When I lost my parents," she said, her voice strong and clear, "I thought I would never be happy again. I carried a locket with a photograph of my last happy memory, and I clung to it because I thought that was all I would ever have. But then Kane found me, saved me, and showed me that the best memories aren't the ones you hold onto from the past, they're the ones you create in the present." These 10 years with him, raising our children, building this life together, have given me more happiness than I ever imagined possible. So here's to the next 10 years and the 10 after that, and all the years we'll have together." They kissed as their friends cheered, and their children ran around their feet laughing. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Kane and Rebecca sat together on their porch, just as they had on so many nights before. "You ever regret it?" Kane asked. "Staying here instead of going to California, building this life with me?" Rebecca looked at him with such love and certainty that Kane felt his breath catch. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You are my home, Kane. You always have been, from the moment you found me in that desert. Everything good in my life came from that day." "Everything good in my life came from that day too," Kane said, pulling her close. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars. The locket sat inside on Rebecca's dresser, but she didn't need it anymore. She had her photographs, her memories, her family. The past was no longer a weight but a foundation, something that had shaped her but didn't define her. As the years continued to pass, Kane and Rebecca's love story became something of a legend in Nogales. People would point to them as proof that happiness could be found even after loss, that love could flourish in the harshest environments. Young couples would ask their advice, and Kane and Rebecca would always tell them the same thing: never take each other for granted, face challenges together, and remember that the best memories are the ones you're making right now. Their children grew up strong and healthy, each one inheriting traits from both parents. James had his father's steady determination and his mother's compassion. Rose had Rebecca's intelligence and Kane's quiet strength. Thomas had his mother's laugh and his father's gift with animals. They all knew the story of how their parents met, how their father had saved their mother in the desert, and they grew up understanding the value of kindness, courage, and love. When Kane turned 50, he and Rebecca took a trip back to the place where they had first met. They rode together on horseback, their bodies moving in perfect sync after so many years together, and found the dried creek bed where he had discovered her all those years ago. "Hard to believe it's been 24 years, Kane said, dismounting and helping Rebecca down. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Rebecca said, looking around. "I remember being so lost, so hopeless. And then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was making. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen," Kane admitted. "Even covered in dust and tears. I knew right then that finding you would change my life, though I didn't understand how much." Rebecca reached up and touched the locket that still hung around her neck, though it had been replaced with a sturdier chain over the years. "I told you this held my last happy memory," she said. "But that's not true anymore. It holds my first happy memory, the first of thousands. The day you found me was the day my life began again." Kane kissed her, long and deep, there in the desert where their story had started. They were older now, their hair streaked with gray, their bodies marked by years of hard work and raising children. But the love between them was as strong as ever, perhaps even stronger, tempered by time and proven by trials. They returned home that evening to find their house full of noise and life. James had come to visit with his wife and their 2 young children. Rose was there with her husband, a carpenter from Tucson. Thomas, still unmarried at 20, was teaching his nieces and nephews how to ride the gentlest of the horses. Mrs. Garrett had passed away 2 years earlier, but Esteban was there, now in his 80s but still spry, entertaining the grandchildren with exaggerated stories. Kane stood on the porch, watching his family, and felt a contentment so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. This was what he had been running from all those years ago, not because he didn't want it, but because he was afraid he would never find it, afraid he wasn't worthy of it. But Rebecca had seen something in him worth loving, and together they had built something beautiful and lasting. Rebecca came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky I am," Kane said simply. "About how one decision to investigate a sound in the desert instead of riding past changed everything." "Fate," Rebecca said with a smile, "or destiny, or maybe just luck. Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it." "So am I," Kane said. "Every single day." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red and purple, Kane and Rebecca stood together, surrounded by the life they had built. Their children's laughter mingled with their grandchildren's squeals of delight. The horses whinnied in their pasture. The wind carried the scent of the dinner Rebecca had prepared, of home and family and love. The locket around Rebecca's neck glinted in the fading light, but it was no longer a symbol of loss. It had become something else entirely, a reminder of the journey she had taken, from desperation to hope, from grief to joy. The photograph inside showed her family, her present instead of her past, and every time she looked at it, she was reminded not of what she had lost, but of everything she had gained. Kane had stopped running the day he found Rebecca in the desert, and in stopping, he had found everything he had been searching for without even knowing it. A home, a family, a purpose, and a love that would last the rest of his days. Years later, when Kane was in his 60s and his body had begun to slow down, he would still ride out to that dried creek bed sometimes, just to remember. Rebecca would often come with him, and they would sit together in the shade of the rocks, holding hands and talking about their life, their children, their grandchildren. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had ridden past that day?" Rebecca asked once. "If you hadn't heard me crying." "No," Kane said firmly, "because you were meant to be found. I was meant to find you. Everything that happened after was meant to be." Rebecca leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that surpassed all expectations. The last photograph taken of them together showed Kane and Rebecca in their 70s, surrounded by their 3 children, their spouses, and their 8 grandchildren. They were seated on the porch of their house, the mountains visible in the background, and despite the lines on their faces and the gray in their hair, they were clearly still deeply in love. Kane's arm was around Rebecca's shoulders, and she was looking up at him with the same expression she had worn on their wedding day, pure, uncomplicated joy. That photograph would be treasured by their descendants for generations, passed down along with the story of how their great-grandparents met in the desert, how a cowboy found a woman with a locket who said it held her last happy memory, and how together they created a lifetime of new memories, each one happier than the last. Kane Zeller passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Rebecca holding his hand. She followed him 6 months later, as if she couldn't bear to be without him even for a year. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Together in life and death. May their love story never be forgotten." And it wasn't forgotten. Their children told their grandchildren, who told their great-grandchildren, about the cowboy who stopped running when he found love in the most unexpected place, and the woman who learned to let go of the past and embrace the future. It became a story about hope and resilience, about the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best. The original locket, with its photograph of Kane, Rebecca, and baby James, was passed down through the family, each generation adding their own story to its legacy. But the meaning had changed from what it was when Kane first saw it glinting around Rebecca's neck in the desert. It was no longer about clinging to the past, but about honoring it while moving forward, about understanding that happy memories aren't finite resources to be hoarded but infinite possibilities to be created, day after day, year after year, for as long as we draw breath. In the end, Kane and Rebecca's story was simple: a man and a woman who found each other when they both needed saving, who chose each other every day, who built a life together one moment at a time. They faced hardships and celebrated triumphs, weathered storms and basked in sunshine, grew older but never grew apart. They proved that love, real love, isn't just about the grand gestures or the passionate moments, though those certainly have their place. It's about showing up every day. It's about choosing to stay when things get hard. It's about building a life together, piece by piece, memory by memory, until you look back and realize you've created something beautiful and lasting. The house they built still stands on the outskirts of Nogales, Arizona, now over 100 years old, maintained by their descendants who refuse to let it fall into disrepair. The barn where Kane bred his horses has been converted into a museum of sorts, filled with photographs and artifacts from their life together. People come from all over to hear the story, to see the place where such a great love flourished. But the real monument to Kane and Rebecca's love isn't the house or the barn or even the locket carefully preserved in a glass case. It's the family they created, the dozens of descendants who carry their blood and their story forward into the future. It's the values they instilled: kindness, courage, loyalty, hope that echo through generations. It's the proof that even in the harshest environments, even after the greatest losses, love can take root and flourish if you're brave enough to try. Kane Zeller rode into the Arizona desert in 1877, a lonely man with nothing but a horse and a mission. He left it with everything that mattered: a partner, a purpose, and a love that would echo through eternity. Rebecca Miller arrived in the desert broken and hopeless, clutching a locket that held her last happy memory. She left it ready to create infinite new ones, her heart healed and her future bright. Their story, like all great love stories, reminds us that we are never as lost as we think we are, never as alone as we feel, and never too broken to be loved. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places: a sound in the desert, a cowboy stopping when he could have ridden on, a woman brave enough to accept help when it was offered. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find someone who sees us not as we are in our worst moment but as we could be in our best. Someone who chooses us, day after day, year after year, building a life together one memory at a time until the locket around our neck holds not just one happy memory but thousands. Each one a treasure, each one a gift, each one a testament to the power of love to transform everything it touches. That was the legacy of Kane and Rebecca Zeller: not wealth or fame, but love. Pure, enduring, transformative love. The kind of love that changes lives, that heals wounds, that turns the desert into a garden and strangers into soulmates. The kind of love that reminds us why we're here and what really matters in this brief, beautiful, complicated life. And in the end, that's the only kind of love worth having.